Hey, folks, we'll give it a few minutes for folks to join and then get started.
Hello.
Hey, Remy. I'm going to give it some time, and while folks are joining, feel free to add your attendance to the meeting notes.
Yep.
Yeah, for folks who are joining, feel free to add your attendance to the meeting notes, and we'll get started in a few minutes. For folks who are joining now, feel free to add your attendance to the meeting notes. We'll get started here in just about a minute. All right. Yeah, we could probably get started here, and some other folks might trickle in. So just as a reminder here, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after, and your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. Cool. So the main thing on the agenda, I know we had discussed some of this previously in both this meeting as well as some of the other, for folks who have been to some of the other meetings, like the supply chain integrity meeting and some of the positioning meetings. What sorts of things can we do to what sorts of things we can do to sort of maybe get more contributors to the project? And so, yeah, that's kind of the main agenda item for today. And I have a thing I've been writing up for sort of like a what is Fresca. And for, I know some folks are very familiar with Fresca who are on, some folks maybe not so much. So one of the things I wanted to kind of highlight here, and just, I'll be sharing my screen, but for folks who just want to have the link, it's in the meeting notes, but they can also just kind of click here. And so to start off, and sorry, what I should say here is want folks to interrupt me. So please, as I'm going through, if there are things that are not clear, ask questions. Also, I'm going to be leaning on folks who are not familiar with, let's say, Fresca, who maybe want to understand more details, and we can kind of go in there. And there's a lot of other things, like if there are things here around, diagrams or anything like that, we have built out a bunch of diagrams over the past year or so that we've done this. So there's definitely a lot there that we can include either in this thing or link to it or whatever. So there's a lot of stuff that is there. I think the problem has been that we just haven't organized it in a way to make it easily consumable for somebody who is, let's say, new and who just wants to understand it. Cool. So I will start with, and I'll be looking at the hands. So feel free to raise your hands. But I'm going to start sharing my screen here in a second. Okay, so this is, I'm writing up an article about what is Fresca, based on some of the previous meetings here, as well as some of the meetings like the supply chain integrity working group meetings, some of the other meetings. A lot of folks are, interested in Fresca, but they're not sure what exactly it is and how to get involved. One of the things that sort of came up was, when I know that a lot of folks have been reprioritized, or they're just, a lot of us are not as able to sort of commit as much time to Fresca lately, and because of that, Fresca is sort of just, I don't want to say it's completely abandoned, but it's we definitely need more folks on it in order to ensure the health of it, and we want to make sure that it's as several different organizations, several different groups of folks who maybe want to contribute can definitely help out and so on. Yeah, John. Yeah, it's like it's stalled. Yeah, that's actually a good word. It's been stalled. So that's kind of the high level goal for why we are writing this article is to say, hey, we think it's valuable. And in fact, in some of the other meetings, when they heard that Fresca was stalled, a lot of folks were like, hey, wait, whoa, hold on. We would love to do stuff with Fresca. We see a lot of presentations with Fresca actually in the presentation. There was a couple from I think OWASP had one with Cyclone DX, and Fresca was in there. There was a few that had Fresca in there in lots of different places. And the thing here is how can we get those folks who are talking about Fresca? Can we get some of those folks actually in here, maybe with hands on keyboard? So that's the high level goal. Does that make sense to folks? All right, seeing a couple thumbs up. Okay, cool. So the high level, and I'm not going to read through everything, but I'll just kind of give you the high level stuff, and feel free to add comments and read through the draft of this thing. And yeah, feel free to add notes in here and comments and whatever, especially folks who are not super familiar with Fresca. If anything is not clear, please add something there. So just as a reminder here, like for folks, like Fresca is, it's for us, like the big thing is the build piece of supply chain security is one of the most critical pieces, at least in our opinion, right? The folks who are working on Fresca. And the reason being, right, is you take a bunch of untrusted source code, often untrusted dependencies and so on, do a bunch of compilation, building, yada, yada, and then you have an artifact at the end. And if that build process gets compromised, you pull in bad source code, you pull in bad dependencies, the build process itself is compromised in something like a sunburst, solar wind style attack or whatever, you end up with potentially malicious software, and not just malicious software, but you end up with potentially a system like a build system, a CI system that is producing only malicious software. So every time you run a new build, you're deploying something new. It's not just a one-time, hey, somebody got into our network. They're now in our network. They have access to our build system. and they're just using that to generate all sorts of bad stuff. Anyway, okay, so that's why we are looking at something like Fresca. Like there's a problem there. Fresca was also inspired by the CNCF Secure Software Factory Reference Architecture, which is, and for disclosure, I was one of the leads on that project at the CNCF. And so that was an architecture for how would you secure a build at a high level. And then Fresca is an implementation of that architecture. And it's trying to do things like follow, security, best practices that are established through things like SLSA, and trying to follow that architecture. So, what is really the goal of Fresca? So, the goal of Fresca is to enable that security for the build piece, right? So some of this still needs to be, but anyway, so the goal here is to sort of enable security on the build. And then we plan to do that by following a couple of principles, right? We want to follow existing framework architecture standards and best practices. These are things like, S2C2F, SLSA, the NIST SSDF, OWASP, SCVS, stuff like that. We don't want to kind of create our own set of best practices unless where we think that there might be gaps. And, we also want to leverage existing tools and components before writing our own. Like a key piece of Fresca here is we're not trying to create a complete, let's say CI system, where something like Tecton or Jenkins or GitHub Actions, we don't want to rewrite that sort of thing from scratch. We want to leverage stuff like Tecton to build out a system like this, right? We don't want to write our own. We think that a lot of these tools that already exist, they just need to have some additional wrappers around them, some additional supporting components. And then we also want to make sure that security is enforced by design as opposed to opt-in. One of the big things, you see in a lot of build systems is, yeah, if somebody adds all these steps, it makes the build more secure. But in a lot of ways, the build systems allow them to leave that out. They can just sort of delete those steps, and unless you're auditing, that's just, those steps don't run. You're potentially, leaving stuff out. And so then the basic idea, right, is to say, actually, this system enforces the running of some of those security steps. You don't get to opt out. It's secure by design. John. Oh, if you're
unmuted, then remuted. So reading through the doc, I'm not sure when the best time is to jump in with my feedback, so I'm just going to jump in now.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So a lot of this to me reads like a set of like architecture or design principles of Fresca, and it's described to me. It feels like it's more describing how is Fresca than like a. And maybe this is just a separate section for like why is Fresca. And I think this is where, from the sounds of it, we're trying to find product market fit a little bit. And I think there's a lot of opportunities. We may not want to be restrictive in describing this, but more open, because like I think what we really want is adoption and usefulness, utilization. How people use it, we're less concerned with, as long as it is useful to people. So I've heard people mention things like using this in their own environments to build secure software. But I've also heard people talk about things like training for different organizations to help learn about secure software supply chain principles. I think another like why is like just proving that this is possible, showing that you can build a secure software supply chain to to these different levels, especially like demonstrating here's how you could do Salsa 3 on-prem or something like that. Like it's one thing to do Salsa 3 with the GitHub Actions workflow and the Salsa verifier and all of that sort of stuff. It's very different to do this in a large enterprise in your own data centers. And so I think like that to me is more of the questions I have, and if I'm interested enough in the why, I'll dive in more into the how, and the exactly what. So I don't know if that makes sense, and I don't know if that like would be helpful in bringing more people, or I think it also could help with the the positioning working group in terms of like, can we position this relative to Salsa and also to SCF or whatever the other thing is. But yeah.
Oh, oops. No, this is great, because once again, like those of us who've been deep in Fresca are like, hey, we think that this is cool because we think that, there's now a secure build system. But I think the problem that we've had is like, yeah, but what does the rest of the world want? Like, even though, obviously some of this stuff, and we saw this with the announcement that when, Citi sort of had contributed this to the OpenSSF, we saw stuff like, hey, Citi found this to be valuable because, they're seeing how this sort of, they wanted to show how this sort of thing works, and so on. But how could the rest of the world see that this is valuable? And I think it just, I think that's where we're trying to kind of figure that out, is like, what are really the needs here for folks? Like, and it's also something that we're trying to kind of dive into a little bit, right? Is we keep seeing Fresca show up in things, but we don't know why. Like, why are folks like, so for example, right, there's a lot of folks from the Salsa side who are like, hey, Fresca is, we think, a big potential component here. And like, okay, well, why? Because we need to have a better understanding of what is the need that folks think Fresca hits, and then we can kind of start diving in a bit more. So I think that's really, really valuable, and maybe something to reframe some of what's going on in this article.
And I think you raise a really important point there, of it's almost like the superhero origin story, right? Of like, where did Fresca come from? And like, we should not lose that, like, that history of it came from like that. The name Citi, like, assuming Citi is okay with this, like the fact that this came from there, and that gives a lot of credence to like, this is really a good idea at large enterprise scale for solving complex problems that will resonate with a lot of people. And they, like, regardless of what they do with Fresca, they can learn from it, and they can learn from this, like, this is as close to a real world example, without like someone open sourcing their entire enterprise's set of like infrastructure and CI/CD pipelines, which is never going to happen, to like getting a look behind the curtain. And so I think that's like another great selling point of this. And it's, once again, like, this is super awkward for me. I'm not a product manager. I don't normally speak like these, like this. So, but I'm trying to think in terms of like, how can we drive this adoption and stuff. And I think there's a cool story to tell there, about like where it came from, and that maybe that's separate from this, or maybe it's just like a small part of a like intro or something.
Cool. Yeah. No. That's super valuable. I'd love to hear. Do other folks have thoughts around that? Oh, Jake?
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things, right? So I can take that Citi has an idea of Fresca and its use and relevance in the organization. I mean, I get that part, but I think when it comes to understanding, especially from a supply chain integrity working group uh, thought process and how we're positioning S2C2F, Salsa, and Fresca together, and putting Fresca in that mold. The relevance is in the tooling around securing the build pipeline. Now that's at a conceptual level. From yourself and the other folks on the call from Kasari, from where Fresca originates, what was the original intent on the design and development of Fresca? And then let's lead with that. Lead with the original intent. And of course, since this is towards finding individuals to contribute and put hands on keyboard, let's follow that up with a call to action. I mean, there's got to. I don't want to see this further stalled or abandoned or anything like that, but there needs to be a call to action that's rooted in, originally it was designed for these things, and this is the relevance because of the work that we're doing on these two items, right? So if we're positioning it next to Salsa and S2C2F, and we're saying that these frameworks are frameworks that we're marching into the future with, this is going to aid those by being that middle piece that says these pipelines can be secured using Fresca, and this is why. Now, I'm not saying that there's not going to be other tools that get developed or that have not been, or that aren't already developed that do the same thing. But what I'm saying is, if this is the anchor to those two frameworks that we're sitting here marching towards legitimate specification, then let's do that, and let that be the stake that we're driving into the ground. I mean, I mean that's my 2 cents on it anyway. And then if you do that, and then we get adopters of Salsa, adopters of S2C2F, and the training therein, then there's not going to be any choice but to understand and learn Fresca at that point, or further develop Fresca at that point, because we've bridged them all together in such a way that you can't have one without the other. Or like I said, there could be other tools that get developed and built, and of course that's organizationally, it's up to any organization to use what they want or what's relevant to their organization, whatever's in their policies or whatever. But if they're going to use S2C2F and use Salsa, the first thought should be, is Fresca as a tool applicable in our environment? If it is, we use it. If it's not, we use a different tool. But the first thought should be, is this applicable? But that can only happen once that real bridging together occurs, and then by then you get the people with the hands on keyboard to come and say, hey, let's go in and let's build this out, right? I mean, that's my 2 cents on it anyway. It's trying to building up inside to say, hey, we want to do this not because it's cool to do, but because, hey, in order for these other things to work successfully, we need this third piece.
Yeah, Jay, oh yeah, no, that was super useful, and I think if I were to take a step back to kind of talk a little bit of where Fresca came from, and once again, like, I think this is useful because as somebody who's been so deep in Fresca, it's like I forget that not everybody understands where it came from, and then also that helps me understand, like, what was the original reason why we created it. It's funny you say that, because it actually originally came out of the desire to show off, like, a lot of folks are using Tecton and Tecton chains, and I won't say who is using Tecton and Tecton chains, but like, obviously a lot of folks are using it, and there was this thing of, well, how do we show off how, like Tecton itself, even though it's super useful, is not secure by it itself is not just secure. Like, there's lots of ways you could attack it and so on. And so we wanted to show some of that off in a demo at Software Supply Chain Security, or Supply Chain Security Con out in 2021. And so we had a bunch of different demo code, and some of this was inspired by some work that some folks at Google were doing and some work that some folks at IBM were doing. And we kind of went and said, hey, like, why don't we take some of these ideas and build it into more of an actual demo? And so we had a demo that showed off, and I have it linked now in the draft here, that Tim and I had given when we were at City. This is, I believe, in 2021. What it was we showed off stuff like, here's a potential supply chain security attack, right? Somebody is going out there and replacing the source code that you think you're about to run, and they replaced it in the build system because the build system has been compromised. But then we showed that that sort of thing would get caught if you start to add in these additional pieces, right? You know, if you add in Tecton plus Tecton chains plus Kyverno as policy management plus, you know, some of these other pieces, that sort of thing would then get caught, right? Because we're actually looking at, you know, is this thing signed? Is this thing approved for use? And then you'd start to see stuff like, wait a second, this hasn't been approved for use, and stuff like that. So that's kind of where that originally came from as an initial demo. And then enough people at that conference were like, hey, is that an actual thing that we can use and start looking at? And so that's kind of where Fresca came out of. That was a bunch of people started asking for that demo code, started asking for like, is this going to be an actual thing that I could potentially use? And that's kind of where it came out of. Arno.
Yeah, I don't mean to derail you, but you know, I think one thing that seems to be, you know, source of confusion to me is that Tecton is not a build system, right? It's a workflow framework essentially, and it's a bit like what, you know, we have GitHub Actions, and you can do all sorts of things with it. And so, you know, you need to go an extra step to actually build a build system with it that would be secure and, you know, comply with Salsa. I always think as Fresca as some kind of a sample implementation of Salsa. And, you know, I'm careful not to say reference because, at least for me, reference implementation has a very specific meaning, but I think it can be presented as a sample implementation, meaning this is an example of how you can implement Salsa.
Cool. Yeah, that's also super valuable. And yeah, I think I agree with you that Tecton today, you know, most folks are using it for builds, but it itself can be used for lots of different things. And also it itself is, you know, it's not, I wouldn't call it insecure by any means, but it's not designed by default to be secure because, hey, it needs to, like, I think one of the things, and I have in here, well, somewhere down in my draft, I have a thing here around, which I think is also valuable, where a lot of these tools, these individual components, and maybe I'll also put this in here as a note, is each of the individual components are designed for flexibility, whereas Fresca is designed for security, right? So like stuff like Kyverno, Tecton chains, and so on are each designed, hey, because there's lots of different use cases. Fresca is designed for a specific use case, which is secure build. We want to provide some flexibility within that use case, but we don't want to say Fresca should, you know, whereas Tecton can be used for all sorts of different things, and Kyverno, right? Kyverno can be used for all sorts of different things. We don't want to say that Kyverno, you know, nobody's going to say Kyverno is designed purely for enforcing policy on the build. No, it's enforced for policy on all these different elements in Kubernetes. Whereas Kyverno inside of Fresca is intended purely for the build. And I think I like that. I like that a lot as well. It's just that sort of, you know, obviously you need to workshop it a little bit, but that sort of this idea of that, you know, all these different things we have are designed for flexibility on their own, but within Fresca, Fresca itself is designed for security, and that's kind of where, yeah.
The value of opinions in a space that is nothing but flexibility and openness and extensibility is like super valuable. People are looking for that everywhere. That's why they pay consultants lots of money to come in and like give them their opinions, because someone has to do that.
So I have an open question for folks, because I know this is one of the things that people have brought up is, I think Fresca is supposed to be, as Arno brought up, is an example of some opinions, right? Everybody's going to have a different set of opinions, but I know one of the things that has come up time and time again with stuff like the whispers of a Sterling tool chain and some of these other things is, how do you provide a set of opinions that, hey, look, we're not saying this is going to work for everybody, but this will work for some folks. And we also want to, obviously, Fresca, I think one of the things that we want to do as well is we want to provide a level or some flexibility within opinions to ensure that folks can't just, we don't want to end up, like, we don't want to, be so opinionated that like folks just find it like nothing really meets, what they need. At the same time, the more flexibility, the more areas where we're not getting across the security thing that we want to get across. But I know that's also one of the reasons why the Sterling toolchain, there's been so many discussions and I don't want to say arguments, but heated debate about like, what does that actually mean in this context? So I'm interested in folks' thoughts on that.
I dropped a Venn diagram at the end of the doc, just as like a place to put it so people could see it. Move it to the notes document or somewhere else if it's better there. Of kind of like, and maybe this is kind of framing for the yellow circle in terms of the like, is the yellow circle the opinions of the implementation or something, but like kind of positioning Fresca at the middle of this between Salsa and S2 C2F and something else, and the question is like, what is that something else? And that's the like the real world use case, the like the comprehensiveness of the security, the opinions about the tooling, or the like, I'm struggling to concisely define all of the things for this like simplified chart, but and this is maybe more of a like a future or ideal state of like the direction rather than necessarily like where it came from or where it is today.
Yeah, that's this, I like this. I like this is valuable. I'm just trying to think through. Yeah, no, I like that too. And I like that sort of idea of like, hey, it's the idea here is Fresca comes in as a way of saying, you have your build needs, you want to be able to kind of come in and you want to layer on you want to layer on these other pieces like S2C2F and Salsa to kind of say, now this is what that like, this is what the example of that thing looks like. I think this sort of thing is something that is that's useful. I'm just trying to think through like, like how do we, I think a lot of this as we kind of go through, there's almost two, once again, two pieces here, and I'll put this in, is like, first is, why is Fresca, right? Well, what was the reasoning behind building this out? And then the second piece is, what is Fresca today, and then what is Fresca tomorrow? I think is kind of a thing that we're trying to get out there, is like, hey, this is like, we built out Fresca to do this stuff. This is what Fresca has become today. we're looking to evolve Fresca over time into whatever folks need. Brendan.
So when I look at a lot of stuff around S2C2F, I see a lot of things talking about ingestion of upstream libraries, validating licenses, things like that. Is that something people want to see Fresca doing? And if so, who wants to do that kind of work?
So my 2 cents, and I think I'll ask Jay for his opinion as well, but my 2 cents was, I think the idea is, I know it's not the most interesting work, but I do think that like there's an element of, imagine you were able to, inside of Fresca, like this is the sort of thing where this was the goal, at least I had in my head, of what the build abstraction framework could be, is like, hey, you go to download some dependencies. But imagine if you had an S2C2F compliant dependency ingestion step that would go through, and when, you know, running, I don't know, pip install or whatever, it would go through and say, okay, great, run like as a combination of different things like Keyverno or whatever, we have a way to sort of enforce that, are these things compliant with S2C2F, right? And assuming they are, okay, you're allowed to now build. But the idea would be that actually, you know, this sort of stuff is not compliant with the organization's policy or whatever, you're not allowed to build. Now, I think that the problem here with some of that is that interesting work for a contributor? I don't know. Yeah, so that's actually a thing, as John had mentioned, like, yeah, these are things I think that, like, this is maybe something that we could ask others to help out with, is like developing some of these policies and just, hey, this just fits in, right? Do you have a policy that, you know, looks for OpenSSF scorecard? And I think that there's going to be a set of folks, I think this is the thing that John had mentioned as well, there's going to be a set of folks who might find that work interesting, who are along the lines of like DevSecOps, DevOps sorts of folks. And then you're going to have folks who are going to say, I don't want to do that. I would much rather, I'd be the one who wants to, let's say, write up the CLI tool that takes those policies and applies them or whatever. Like, I want to write that. Like, and I think that might be something. At the same time, I also recognize the chance that a lot of folks are like, this is why the McKinseys of the world get paid all this money to do the, you know, and I know not just, you know, McKinsey, but like all the consultancies of the world get paid all the money to go in and do a lot of that like glue work that a lot of other folks don't want to do. John.
The reason, I'll just finish my point and then we'll pass it over to John. The reason that it gets my attention is that the typical way that I feel like I've seen these set up when you're trying to do some kind of artifact ingestion is that you're spinning up a whole Artifactory server that's going through that. There's a process to ingest any data into that Artifactory server. And then you're limiting network connectivity from your build server to only talk to that Artifactory server. And so I'm thinking of what the scope of Fresca has historically been and what it would take to expand the scope to that additional kind of workload there. And it seems very non-trivial to me. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly don't think it would be trivial to like introduce an entire additional framework to the project. I do think that there's like, maybe there's already a missing piece as I like think through this 3 circles of like the 4th circle of the actual application you're trying to put through this, because that includes the dependencies, the code that you write. There's a draft blog article for Salsa explaining the separation of like source and build. And I think about that when I think about Fresca as well, in terms of like, no matter how good your supply chain is and your pipelines and everything else, like if you write crappy code with security vulnerabilities, you still have crappy code with security, but like it's still a vulnerable supply chain because of the code. And like, how do we represent that idea, or the resolution to that of like, do we have to go and like, maybe it's like Fresca plus a sample application that's going through the pipeline of like, and maybe it's like Fresca not plus plus as in an incremental version of it, but like a Fresca plus something else of like a sample application or a modification of, there's lots of cloud native sample applications out there that we could look at. And like, how do you make that more secure by putting it through this and securing the code and applying the S2C2F framework or something. And I'll admit, I don't know much of anything about that right now. So they're trying to learn more, but.
Yeah, so yeah, I think to provide a little bit of context there also on the build versus source stuff, given that I'm the one who also wrote that as well, is yeah, I think the thing is, I think it also maybe addresses a little bit of Brendan's point, is maybe the focus just needs to be on that interface and making that interface really clear. So the idea should be the interface is like Kyverno might just be like, hey, I'm expecting everything that comes in. Like I'm going to pull something from this network location. But in order to ensure that it is S2C2F compliant, I'm expecting it to be signed with this key or something like that. Or I'm expecting this metadata to come along with all the artifacts. Because once again, I think the idea here is we don't want to have where it doesn't make sense, Fresca to in addition take on all this extra stuff, but you want to essentially in the zero trust sense re-verify, right? Like you want to just say, hey, I'm expecting this thing to have this identity. And if I try to pull these artifacts down and all of a sudden it doesn't have those identities associated with it, then we're just going to fail the build and just sort of say, hey, look, I'm expecting an S2C2F compliant artifact and I'm not getting that. And that's just it. The other thing I think, which is just if Fresca is successful, I think one of the things that has been brought up by a few folks is folks have said, not necessarily that Fresca itself is is the Sterling toolchain by any means, but they could see something like Fresca fitting into a build element of that Sterling toolchain, right? Where you might say a Fresca compliant, a S2C2F compliant artifact server is one piece, a Sterling toolchain compliant, version control system is another piece. Fresca is the piece for the build, and so on and so forth. And all those pieces combined allow for, what you might imagine a Sterling toolchain looks like. And so we could just be that piece, and then we could say, hey, look, in order for Fresca to be successful, we need to have an S2C2F compliant artifact server. Can, OpenSSF, can somebody work on that? Brendan?
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning toward the latter because when I think of the former, trying to set up some kind of interface of here's just how you request any S2C2F compliant artifact, I'm immediately thinking that means that we're going to have some kind of network proxy in there, and you say all the requests have to go through the network proxy, and then that proxy has to do all that validation for the upstream Go library, the upstream pip library, the upstream npm library, and there are too many of those. It's going to be an unlimited process that you get into, and so it feels a whole lot better if we say, here's just what an artifact repository looks like, and we spin up the secure build server, someone else spins up the secure artifact server, and it's up to the end user to make sure that the build server can only talk to the artifact server.
Yeah, I think that's valuable. I mean, I also think that, like, if you were to look at something like, let's assume that there is a Sterling toolchain at some point in the future, you might imagine that Sterling toolchain has a governance function, and that governance function, and I don't want to pitch the article I released yesterday, but like you could imagine, right, there is some sort of control plane that should enforce policy and governance across the SDLC. And so you might imagine that Fresca, gets its policy also externally. Like, there's going to be certain elements that are applicable purely to the build. But like, once again, I can imagine a world that says that something has signed off that an artifact is S2C2F compliant. And then the idea would be that Fresca just goes and says, Fresca has been told S2C2F compliant artifacts are signed with this key. Let's just keep it simple for now. Okay, cool. So anytime it downloads a dependency, it should be validating that it's been signed with that key. And assuming it has been, then we assume it's S2C2F compliant. And so that means like, hey, if, you know, something tries to, and I know there's like, you know, once again, I think the idea here is you know, it's always going to be, I think, a combination of network controls. And then what happens if, you know, DNS has been messed with and you're now pointing to something else? I don't know. But I also think that, once again, I think if we're getting to that point of like, hey, do we need to verify if this thing is S2C2F compliant? I think we've already solved a whole bunch of other problems already.
Yeah, the challenge for me is that it means that all the build tooling needs to be aware that it needs to talk to that proxy, and that proxy needs to be aware of what artifacts it's talking to. And when you've got someone building a jar, and so they're saying, let me pull the current version of log4j, they know who signed that thing, and do they have a signing system for their tooling or not? That's always part of the challenge.
Oh yeah. So once again, I think the idea here is not to necessarily put the burden on Fresca to do it as much as, like, I guess maybe enable it, right? Like the idea here is to say, if you have S2C2F, you should be able to have the capability to, well, I would just maybe, I think I get your point. I think maybe table that for now and say, hey, if we ever get to that, we can have the discussion. But I think if we are having that discussion, we've already solved a million other problems. And because I can imagine, you know, that sort of thing, once again, is just something like the Sterling tool chain, right? Where, you know, Fresca is perhaps aware of, hey, when I download or a Fresca step, right? Like a Fresca build step could be aware, like, you know, this is the secure S2C2F compliant or S2C2F aware build step, so for PEP. And so it knows when I download, it takes in, let's say, you know, an identifier for where, you know, what sort of identity should be signing all these things. And anyway, I don't want to go too deep into the rabbit hole there, but I think that's still valuable there.
Yeah, I realize it's a huge rabbit hole, and that's where I'm trying to say, let's not jump into that rabbit hole just yet, seeing how complicated it is. And Jay, feel free to jump in if we're over conflating some of the challenges here. But when I look at the little last picture we were looking at, I'm thinking Fresca might not be in the middle of the picture. It might just be on the left side of the picture. And that's all.
I mean, first of all, I love the conversation. I love the back and forth, and I love the forward thinking thought about this too. And I get to learn something, because at first glance on Fresca, when I looked into Fresca, and of course I've been coming to meetings, but when I went on to the website and I really read into it, I looked at this as being sort of like you start off with S2C2F, and you're injecting, and you got the dependency management, and you're really trying to verify that, you know, the place where you're getting stuff from is a good place, and you're going through all those steps, you know what I mean? And then you go into the build pipeline, and then it's about securing that build pipeline in such a way that it does those checks. It says, upon entering the build pipeline, these things need to be verified. All the way throughout into the end of that build pipeline, where you get into the salsa territory, where it might do an additional check to say, okay, now that you're getting ready to go into this, are these things ready to go in front of salsa for salsa's checks, right? So that was my thought upon, and of course, using that as an automated tool that does that, right? You got to build those parameters, but that was my thought about Fresca originally. So I looked at that as going from end to end in the build pipeline. That's why I originally said, look, if we're positioning these three together, and I'm looking at this saying, I think that's phenomenal. Let's do it, but let's be concrete in that, because in my mind, only through that are you going to get both people who want to improve upon it, and those same people will generally become the adopters, right? So that was my hell. You could build training around this, right? So you can build a training environment where you have, like right now we're developing training for S2C2F, so you could build that training on that end. You could build training around how to use Fresca to do those checks. You could build training around how to do those checks at the end. You could build training around how to then conduct, do salsa at the end, right? So I mean, like that's my mindset when I think about this at a macro level. But this conversation says, well, maybe it is more towards the front until we, and I say maybe towards the front until we completely develop the back, because we're still looking at salsa 1.0, and we're still looking at source integrity in salsa as well. So salsa is going to eventually cover source integrity. Well, what does that look like against Fresca at that point, right? Because now we're back to the left side again. So there's a few things here that, I mean, the conversation can just grow, but I like the conversation here. I don't know that I have much more to add until we really nail down scope, and then the potential scope creep or potential expansion of that scope to meet the total vision, right? So, I mean, that's my 2 cents on that anyway.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So I think since we have 10 minutes left, I think the question I have is just, what do you think? Since I'm going to lead the charge on this, what do you think I should do? What do folks think I should do to kind of do this? Do they think that should I rewrite this article to focus a little bit more on the why is Fresca? What sorts of things do you think I can do to kind of and also, like, where do you think that this article or whatever should go? Like, what sorts of things do folks think that I can do to sort of try and make this impactful? Because, like, once again, I think the big thing here is a lot of folks see there's a lot of opportunity with something like Fresca, but then, at the end of the day, we still need to have hands-on keyboard to actually build out, whatever it is, whether it is, a bit more focused on these features versus those features. We definitely need folks who could be hands-on keyboard engineers on it.
Well, I definitely think. I definitely think that this. We think about what we want to do here, and then we bring it back before the positioning group, so positioning group can help write this stuff out. I mean, like let's use all the features, right? All the features of the working group. But ultimately, what was the original intent, and then what is our thoughts for scale? What are our thoughts on scaling, right? How do we scale, and what's our thoughts for growth? If it's, and I keep saying this, that let's be concrete, and this is the vision, and then a call to action against that vision. You got, I mean, I hate saying hearts and minds, but you got to get into the hearts and minds, but that can only be done through those that are passionate about S2C2F, passionate about salsa. And of course, if the ultimate vision is to have Fresca as that third piece right in the middle that does that end to end, that ties it all together, then let that be the vision, let that be the passion, and then let those that are on both sides, and then we can say, hey, we got engineers in this org, we got engineers in that org, come in, let's put our hands on it, and let's build out these things, both in concept and design for what it is, and then let's think about what it can be. Let's think about how this scales going forward. Let that imagination run wild, but that can only happen when you're tight knit on an original intent, which is and I'm saying all this stuff, and I guess in my mind of an article, that's probably something I would want to read. Not being a hands-on keyboard person, but knows a lot of hands-on keyboard people, that would be something I want to read to say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. You think you want to come in and put your hands on it and touch it a little bit. You know what I mean? And they'll be more willing to do that based on an intent, rather than me saying, hey, there's this cool thing, Fresca. It's supposed to be real good for supply chain security. Maybe we ought to give it a look. No. Let's not. Let's be very exact in our approach. And I think that's what my mindset is saying.
The word that you said that I like a lot is concrete. And that's something that, I'm coming in as more the engineer. And so I look at this and say, let's make sure we can actually do what we say we want to do before we tell everybody we're going to do it. I'd love to use a perpetual motion machine to solve the world energy problems. That would be awesome. And we can probably get a whole bunch of people behind that solution and say it's a great thing to implement. But at the end of the day, if you can't build it, then it doesn't help us. And so I want to make sure that what we're proposing we can actually create. And so we have some kind of rough idea what the design would look like, and then go out and get some people to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I know and I know down here, I kind of had some of the stuff that I think was what was sort of the goal, like a bit more of the concrete, what is Fresca trying to do? And to kind of just, and feel free to read through some of it down there, but the idea, right, was to be an implementation of the secure software factory reference architecture, which, like, to be clear here, it just means, hey, we want to secure the build. We want to be able to run a secure build where we're protected against classes of attacks. And, I'm not going to go too deep into what those classes of attacks are, but basically it's like you want to protect against developers not running the right steps. Like if you should be running an SBOM, if you should be generating an SBOM, it automatically generates an SBOM. And if you try to work around that, it doesn't work, right? Like that's the sort of thing there. The second piece being, hey, you want to protect against attacks against the actual orchestration of workloads, right? This is stuff like Smithy Spire, right, where you want to make sure that, hey, if a administrator on your Kubernetes cluster or your infrastructure tries to mess with the builds, it should get caught, right? And then finally, you want to have something like eBPF style stuff to essentially make sure that the workloads as they're running, are they doing something very obviously suspicious, right? I think those are kind of the three high-level practical things we want to do. And then, well, how do we achieve that? Well, we could follow Salsa, we can do some of these other things, and then that helps sort of build out that secure build package. And I think that's kind of, yeah. And I think, yeah, as John had mentioned as well, that's another problem of, and I think the thing is having talked to people about some of this is developers, they want two things, right? They want the flexibility when they need it, and they don't want to do the thing if they don't have to, right? They want to write the code. If you tell them, like, one of the problems with some of the secure build stuff is if you tell a developer, oh, you need to generate an SBOM, and they're like, how do I do that? Now you're telling me I need to learn this new tool about generating SBOMs. And that's kind of, I think, one of the other things, as I think a secondary goal of Fresca is to make that secure piece easy, right? Like, is to sort of enable like stuff like, hey, I'm generating an SBOM. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, you're getting very, very close to an area of thought I've been having lately, which is the unspoken problem with supply chain security is it's still security, and like security never gets prioritized, never gets funded, all these other problems that the rest of the security world has known for so long, and they've gotten through the hype cycle and now I think we're starting to get to that point. At the same time, doing everything you just described for the developers without them having to think about it can deliver a whole different set of business value for organizations where they need to understand that better. And I've been trying to think about this for our supply chain working group as well too, of can you get to production faster because of this? Like, can you write code faster, iterate on your apps faster?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. The thing that immediately comes to mind that I think we had as one of a core goal or as a secondary goal here is like, folks should think of this like libraries and frameworks in the software sense, right? Like, when somebody uses React, right, they know they have to like understand React, but they're not going in and having to understand all the different elements of the DOM. React handles that, right? React is handling the DOM, the actual DOM for you, or whatever you're using. It's like, hey, it's an abstraction here. It's handling all that for you. And so it's the same thing when a developer comes in and says, I don't want to have to think about SBOM. Great, you don't. We've thought about SBOM. And I think it's that sort of thing that I think is something that we need to do. But I think that sort of thing too, I know, Brandon is thinking about this, is like, it's like they are things layered on top of each other. There is Fresca itself, which is a suite of build tools configured to operate securely, right? And then there is something that you want to layer on top of Fresca to make sure that what is actually being run inside of Fresca is also meets those security needs, right? Like anybody can generate an SBOM. The problem is, can you generate an SBOM in a way that you are convinced that that SBOM, you know, like if I generate an SBOM on my local workstation, I could send you whatever and you know, you'd have no idea. But if I generate an SBOM in a secure build system, you're like, great, I am pretty sure in the very least that that SBOM hasn't been compromised, right? That SBOM wasn't generated by something malicious. It was generated by this source.
So
yeah.
100% agree with all that. But for me, I'm trying to think of this like, I like the library analogy, but rather than a library for an SBOM or the specific like tool, think of it as a library for your change review board. You don't have to spend as much time sitting around waiting for some manual approval. Here is the attestation and the proof that like your organization can trust this and push it to prod or whatever else you need to do.
Yep, and so I know we're at time, and I don't want to hold people. I can stay on for a few more minutes if folks wanted to chat, but feel free to drop off if anybody has, if anybody needs to. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing for me, and I 100% agree there, right? Because as somebody who's worked in banks before, right? The problem is always the change review board. You end up with a bunch of different things that people are like asking you, like, did it go through the security review process? And usually the security review process is extraordinarily manual. And that's why developers often hate security, is they're like I've been there, right? I've been there where somebody goes and says, oh, did you get the firewall rules? And I'm like, why is it that I have to wait to get the firewall rules until I get to the change review board? Like, it's like this weird, like it was this weird thing. And the idea should be, well, you can enforce these things at the build level. You can enforce these things at lots of different areas. And once again, the idea here is not that Fresca should enable all of it, but Fresca should enable the build piece. And other elements of perhaps something like a Sterling toolchain should enable the rest of that. And I think that sort of thing is potentially super valuable. And also, on the Sterling toolchain thing, I have a separate proposal I plan to bring to the TAC. Well, first I plan to shop around some of the working groups to kind of talk through some of that, which is like, hey, here's generally probably what supply chain security looks like from an end-to-end standpoint. Like, you want to secure developer writing code through to production. There's a lot of different tools there. Fresca fits in, let's say, a build element, but there's also something that's at the top, which is the holistic sort of policy that the organization comes in and says, what should be, what should happen before this thing ends up in production, right? Or actually as it goes through each stage and gets gated, right? The same way you want to say, like, a developer should not be able to download malware directly to their workstation, write some code, and then push that code out to, something, right? That's not the build doesn't take care of that, but there should be something that goes and says, hey, I noticed you did something really weird, or I noticed that your laptop somehow is logged in at like 3 a.m. halfway across the world. What's going on? Like there's those sorts of things that I think organizations want to have, and the way that they're currently doing it is via manual workflows, right? They're just kind of coming in and saying, hey, is this thing, did this go through this approval? Did this person, check all the boxes? Do you have the IP addresses for the firewall rules in this document? Like, that's the sort of thing. Whereas all of that should be, mostly automated, and the build piece is just one component there. Anyway, I know we're at time, but I definitely get a ping a bunch of you on Slack with additional questions. I think I'm going to continue to write up some of this stuff. Please, 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 folks, add comments to this document, add things, including, I would totally rewrite it focusing on this. That is totally okay. We can definitely do that. And if there are things that folks think that, should help, would be awesome. And I also just wanted to say, I also totally agree with regarding the training piece, like one of the big things was, I know a lot of folks today, or not a lot, but a few folks today are using Fresca or have used Fresca as a training thing to say, hey, look, you're not using Kyverno, but let's just assume you are for a second. Here's like the sorts of things you could do to sort of institute policy against your build and yada, yada. But awesome. Anyway, so I'll see everybody later. I don't want to take up any more time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.